There is something a man learns after enough years alone on the frontier. He learns that silence has a texture to it. That the quiet inside an empty house feels different from the quiet out on the open range. One kind of silence rests easy on a man's shoulders. The other kind settles in his chest like a stone he cannot lift and cannot put down. I had been carrying that second kind for close to 11 years when I first picked up an axe and walked across the fence line to help my neighbor, Eleanor Marsh. I want to tell you right now, I did not walk over there thinking anything grand was going to happen. I was not a young man with poems in his pockets and fire in his blood. I was 52 years old. My knees ached when the weather changed. My hair had gone mostly silver by the time I was 45. I had a ranch that kept me busy enough to stay out of trouble, and I had learned, or so I believed, to be satisfied with that. But there is a difference between being satisfied and being at peace. I did not fully understand that difference until the afternoon I stood in Eleanor Marsh's yard with wood chips on my boots and sweat on my collar. And she walked out of her house carrying 2 tin cups of coffee, and she looked at the pile of split wood stacked neatly against her porch, and she smiled. Not the polite kind of smile a neighbor gives when she feels obliged. A real one, the kind that moves slow across a woman's face and reaches her eyes before it's done traveling. And she said, quiet and easy and with just a little bit of mischief in it, "Where were you 20 years ago?" She was joking, or mostly joking. That is what I told myself. But those words followed me back across the fence line. They sat with me through supper and through the long evening after, while the fire burned low and the wind moved across the plains outside my window. They were still with me in the morning when I woke up before the sun and lay there in the dark wondering why a simple joke from a woman I barely knew had unsettled me the way it did. Sometimes the ordinary things are the ones that change everything. This is the story of that autumn in Grantham County in the year of 1883, and what a pile of firewood, a cup of coffee, and one woman's laugh taught me about what it means to finally be seen. The town of Harlow Bend sat at the edge of the high plains like something a man had dropped there by accident and then decided to keep. It was not a beautiful town in the way that mountain towns could be beautiful, with their pine-covered slopes and cold, clear creeks. Harlow Bend was flat and wide and windswept, with a main street of maybe 12 buildings and a population that hovered around 230 souls. Give or take whoever had come in on the last supply wagon or gone out on the one before it. There was a general store run by a man named Calhoun who was polite enough to your face and a champion gossip the moment you turned your back. There was a church with a good preacher, a schoolhouse with a young teacher who was barely older than her students, a sheriff named Dade who was fair and tired in equal measure, and a saloon that was the most reliably crowded building in town on any given Saturday. And there were the surrounding ranches and homesteads scattered across the flats and the low rolling hills beyond, connected to Harlow Bend by dusty roads and the slow rhythm of seasons. My name is Jonas Hale. I had worked a cattle operation about 3 miles northeast of town for going on 20 years. It was never a grand outfit. 40 head at my peak, a barn that I had rebuilt twice after weather took it apart, a farmhouse that could have used a woman's attention in a dozen different ways that I had learned to stop noticing. My wife Clara had died of fever in 1872. We had been married 6 years. We had no children, which was a grief we had both carried quietly and separately, the way couples sometimes do when a sorrow is too tender to share directly. After Clara, I buried myself in work the way men do. It was not courage, it was just the only path I could see clearly enough to follow. My neighbor to the south was a woman named Eleanor Marsh, and I am somewhat ashamed to say that in the 2 years since she and her late husband Robert had taken up that property, I had exchanged fewer than a dozen real conversations with her. Robert Marsh had died of a heart seizure in the spring of 1882, a strong-looking man brought down quietly and completely, the way strong men sometimes are. He had been 58 years old. Eleanor was 47. The town of Harlow Bend grieved properly, brought casseroles for a week, and then moved on. That is the custom. A widow was not an unusual thing in those years, and a capable woman managing a modest property alone was not unusual either. People assumed Alina would be fine because she looked fine, calm, and composed at the funeral, gracious with the condolences, back to managing her affairs within the week. People see what they expect to see. That is as true on the frontier as anywhere else. What I noticed, and I noticed only because my property line ran along hers and I could not entirely avoid seeing it, was that by October of 1883, Alina Marsh was burning through the last of a very small woodpile, and a hard winter was coming in fast off the northwest. I could tell from the smoke out of her chimney, she was burning more than she should have for the temperature, which meant her wood was green or wet. And the stack visible from my fence line was low enough to concern a man who had spent 20 winters in that county. I will not pretend the decision to help was complicated. It was the right thing to do, that is all it was. That first morning, I took my axe and I walked across the fence. She was on her porch when I came through the gate. Alina Marsh was not a small woman in any sense, not tall exactly, but upright and solid in the way of a person who has spent years doing real work. She had dark hair gone partly gray at the temples, pulled back the way practical women keep it on working days. Her eyes were brown and watchful. She had good hands, wide across the knuckles, with a few small scars the way hands get when they have been useful for a long time. She looked at me and then at the axe and did not say anything right away. "Morning," I said. "I noticed your wood supply is getting low. I've got time this morning if you'll let me split a few." She studied me for a moment the way a careful person studies an offer they are not sure they deserve or trust. "Jonas Hale," she said slowly, "you have not spoken more than 2 sentences together to me in 2 years. That is probably about right," I admitted. "And now you want to split my wood." "I do." She looked out at the gray sky to the northwest. She looked back at me. "The woodpile is around the side," she said. It took me the better part of 3 hours. The wood was not only low but partly punky from being stacked directly on the ground without enough air beneath it. I split what was good and set aside what was not, and by the end of it I had a respectable stack of dry split wood against her porch wall, high enough to last a good stretch of cold weather. Assuming she was careful with it. When I finished, Alina came out with 2 tin cups of coffee. She handed me one without making a ceremony of it, and we stood there a moment looking at the wood. "That is good work," she said. It needed doing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, that slow, traveling smile I told you about, and she said it. "Where were you 20 years ago?" I laughed. It surprised me how easily it came out. 20 years ago I was younger and considerably more foolish," I said. "Aren't we all?" she said, and she sipped her coffee and looked out at the plains, and the moment passed the way easy moments do, gently, without a clear ending. I walked back across the fence and went on about my day, but the thing about a moment that passes easy is that it does not always go away. Sometimes it just waits. I started stopping by after that. Not every day, maybe once a week, sometimes twice when I had reason. Always with a practical purpose. I fixed a board on her gate that had been hanging crooked. I helped her reset a fence post that had heaved up in the first hard frost. She never asked. I never made a speech about it. I would just show up with whatever tool the job required, do the work, and accept whatever she offered, coffee or sometimes a biscuit if she had been baking. Or on one occasion, a piece of apple pie that was as good as any pie I had tasted in 11 years of eating alone. We talked, slowly at first, the way people do when they are not sure yet what kind of conversation they are capable of having with each other. We talked about the weather, about cattle prices, about the road to town, and whether the county would ever properly grade it, about her garden, about my barn. Then gradually we talked about other things, about Robert a little and about Clara a little. About the particular strangeness of getting used to doing everything alone after years of doing it alongside someone, about how the house sounds different when there is only one person in it. The clock, she said one afternoon. Robert always wound the clock. I kept forgetting to wind it after he passed. I would wake up in the night and hear the silence where the ticking used to be, and it would take me a moment to remember why. I understood that completely. I told her so. What was it for you? She asked. I thought about it. The coffee pot, I said. Clara always made the coffee first thing. For a long time after, I would come downstairs and be surprised there was no coffee made. Even after I started making my own, it never tasted quite the same. Probably just my imagination. Probably not, Alina said. Those conversations did something to me that I had not expected. They reminded me what it felt like to be known by another person's, not admired, not needed, not tolerated, but actually known. Seen all the way through, the ordinary parts included. I had forgotten how much a person can miss that without fully realizing what it is they are missing. Harlow Bend was a small town, and small towns have long memories and short patience for anything that looks like it might become interesting. By November, people had noticed that Jonas Hale was spending time at the Marsh property with a regularity that went beyond good neighborliness. Calhoun at the general store noticed it first, as he noticed most things, and mentioned it to the preacher's wife, who mentioned it to the women at the church quilting circle, who refined and amended the information among themselves until it had taken on a shape somewhat different from what it had originally been. What it had originally been was a widower helping a widow prepare for winter. What it became, in the telling, was something more pointed and more gossip-worthy. An old lonesome man making a play for a grieving woman who was barely a year past her husband's death. I heard this secondhand from my friend Virgil Tate, who ran the livery and who told me things he thought I ought to know in the direct, uncomfortable way that only real friends manage. They're talking, Virgil said. Calhoun's wife said Alina Marsh ought to know better than to let a man court her before she's even finished mourning. I am not courting her, I said. I know that, Virgil said, but you might want to think about whether anybody else does. I did think about it. What I concluded was that people were going to think what they were going to think. And there was not much a man could do about that short of minding his own business in a way that left Alina without firewood in the middle of a hard winter, and I was not prepared to do that. What I did not account for was how Alina might be affected by the talk. She was proud, quietly but firmly so. She cared what the town thought of her, not out of vanity but out of something more practical. She lived there. Her business dealings depended on people treating her fairly. And a widow's reputation in a small town was a fragile thing that could be damaged in ways a man's could not as easily. The church social in mid-November was the moment things became uncomfortable. Alina had come into town for it, as she usually did. I had come for the same reason most unattached men of a certain age came to church socials. It was better than sitting alone, and the food was reliably good. Calhoun's wife, Marvella, was a woman who conducted social events the way a general conducts a campaign, with complete confidence in her own authority and very little patience for territory she had not personally organized. She caught Alina near the dessert table and said with a sweetness that had sharp edges underneath it, I do hope Jonas Hale is not becoming a burden to you, Alina dear. Some men, particularly lonely men of a certain age, can misread a neighborly woman's kindness. Alina's expression did not change in any dramatic way. But something moved behind her eyes, a quick, controlled flash of something that was not quite anger and not quite embarrassment, but somewhere between the two. Jonas has been a generous neighbor, Alina said, even and clear. I imagine a woman alone has reason to be grateful for that. Of course, Marvella said and smiled and moved on. I was not close enough to have heard the exchange. I learned of it later. But I saw Alina's face after it happened, saw the way she held herself a little more carefully than she had before. The way her chin had come up a degree or two, and I could read enough of what it meant to feel a cold discomfort in my stomach. On the ride home that evening, I thought about what I was doing and why. The honest answer was not as simple as I wanted it to be. I was helping a neighbor, that was true. But I admitted to myself in the dark and cold of the wagon ride, looking for reasons to cross that fence line. And those two things were not exactly the same thing, and pretending they were was a small dishonesty that did not sit well with me. December came in hard. The way December in Grantham County often did, a fast-moving cold front that dropped 6 inches of snow in 2 days and left the temperature sitting well below freezing for the better part of a week. I checked my own cattle, made sure the water troughs were not frozen solid, spent a day reinforcing the barn against the wind. And then sat in my house for 2 days doing the necessary indoor work while the storm moved through. On the third morning, I looked out at the sky, which had cleared to a sharp and brilliant blue, and then I looked south in the direction of Alina's property. And I felt the familiar pull of practical concern. Was she managing? Was the woodpile holding, alongside something else that I was finding it harder to call purely practical? I stayed home that day and the next, not because I did not want to go. Because I wanted to go too much, and I was a man of 52 with sense enough to understand that wanting something too much is the moment when you ought to slow down and think clearly. I thought about Marvella Calhoun's words, which I had heard about secondhand. I thought about Alina's chin coming up at the dessert table. I thought about the fact that Robert Marsh had been dead for 18 months, and a man who showed up every week with an axe and a willingness to help could look like quite a few different things, depending on who was doing the looking. I thought about Alina herself, what she had said, what she had not said, what had moved behind her eyes on various occasions when a word or a silence had landed between us in a particular way. And I thought about my own age and the ache in my knees and the gray in my hair. And the 11 years of solitude that had shaped me into someone considerably different from the man I had been at 30. Whether that different man had anything to offer a woman like Alina Marsh, anything she would actually want. Not just tolerate out of loneliness or habit, was a question I could not answer honestly from the inside. What I knew was this: she had joked about 20 years ago. She had said it lightly, the way you say something you mean only partly and then watch to see if the other person understands which part. I was not sure I had understood. I was not sure I was ready to try to understand. I stayed home through the end of that first week of December. I told myself it was because of the roads and the cold. That was partly true. The rest of the truth was that I was afraid in the quiet, reasonable way that a man who has already lost one thing he deeply loved becomes afraid of caring again. Not dramatically afraid, just carefully afraid, the kind of fear that looks exactly like good sense if you do not look too closely at it. On the Saturday of that week, I got a note delivered by the Hutchins boy who ran messages around the county for a coin. The note was in Alina's handwriting, which was small and clear and neat. It said, "The gate post you reset in October has heaved up again. I expect the frost got under it. No urgency, but when you have time, that was all. No urgency when you have time." I read it 3 times, then I set it on the table and went to bed and stared at the ceiling for a while. She had not asked me to come. She had told me there was no urgency. She had given me every reason to take my time, or not to come at all. A woman of Alina Marsh's particular pride does not write a note like that unless she means it to be something other than a simple request for practical help. I folded the note and put it in the tin box where I kept important papers. Then I lay back and listened to the wind outside and thought about 20 years ago and what kind of man I might have been then and what kind of man I was now. I went over on Sunday morning, after the temperature had come up enough to make the roads manageable. She was in the yard when I arrived, breaking ice from the water trough with the blunt end of an axe handle, working steadily and without apparent difficulty. She looked up when she heard my horse on the road and raised one hand briefly in acknowledgement, then went back to what she was doing until I had tied my horse at the fence and come through the gate. "Post is over this way," she said, gesturing. We walked around to the east side of the property. The post had indeed heaved, tilted at an angle that would eventually pull the fence wire with it if left to continue. It was not a difficult repair. I had the tools I needed. I got to work. Eleanor did not go inside. She brought a blanket from the house and sat on an overturned crate nearby, watching me work the way a person watches who is comfortable with silence but not uninterested in company. We talked a little. About the storm, about the cattle, about a letter she had received from her daughter in Abilene. I had not known she had a daughter, a young woman named Grace, married with 2 small children. She wants me to come to Abilene, Eleanor said, live with them. I kept working. Are you going to? No, she said without hesitation. Why not? Because I am not a person who goes and lives with someone else's family, she said simply. Because this is my land, because I am not finished here yet. I understood that, I said so. Jonas, she said after a pause that was long enough to be intentional. Yes, you have not been over in 2 weeks. I looked up at her. She met my eyes directly the way she always did when she meant something. The storm, I said. The storm was finished by Tuesday, she said. I set the fence bar down and straightened up and looked at her. I know, I said. She waited. I had prepared nothing to say. That was probably better. The prepared thing is rarely the honest thing. I was thinking, I said, about whether I was making a mistake. What kind of mistake? I took a breath. The kind where a man convinces himself he has a practical reason for being somewhere when the practical reason is not really what is pulling him there. The wind moved between us. The long, dry prairie wind that has no consideration for important conversations. And, Eleanor said, and I decided honesty was better than caution, even if caution is the safer thing. She was quiet for a moment. Her expression did not change, but her hands, which had been resting on her knees, moved slightly, just a small, unconscious settling, the way hands move when something tense inside a person eases. My daughter's letters, she said slowly. She says I ought to be careful. That grief makes people reach for the nearest comfort without thinking clearly. That is probably true sometimes, I said. Grace thinks I am lonely and foolish, Eleanor said. She thinks I should come to Abilene and let her take care of me. Are you lonely? I asked. She looked at me steadily. I was, she said. Less so lately. I picked up the fence bar again and finished setting the post. It took another 20 minutes. Eleanor sat on her crate and the wind moved and neither of us said anything for a while, but it was the kind of silence that has warmth in it rather than weight. When I was done, I straightened up and looked at the post, solid now in the frozen ground. I should have come sooner, I said. 2 weeks was too long to stay away over a fear I have not even properly looked at yet. What are you afraid of? She asked. I turned and looked at her. There was no judgment in her face. Only the careful attention of a person who genuinely wants to know, caring about someone and losing them again, I said. And perhaps more than that, caring about someone and not knowing whether I have anything worth giving anymore. Whether I am too set in my ways and too worn down to be what a person needs. Eleanor stood up from the crate. She folded the blanket over her arm. She looked at me the way she had looked at that first pile of firewood, with something that was honest and a little bit wondering and not at all pitying. Jonas, she said. You came and split my wood when you did not have to. You fixed my gate and reset my fence posts and brought me coffee when there was nothing in it for you. Nobody made you do any of that. It needed doing, I said. It was what I had said that first morning. I know, she said. That is what I keep thinking about. She went inside. I stood there for a moment in the cold, bright December air, and something shifted in me that I did not have a good word for. Not certainty exactly, something quieter than that, a direction. Christmas in Harlow Bend was marked by a church service, a community supper at the schoolhouse, and the predictable performance of the town's social architecture, who sat with whom, who was noticed. Who was conspicuously absent, who had brought the better pie. Eleanor came, I came. We sat at the same long table, which had not been a deliberate arrangement, or perhaps it had been, slightly, and we ate together alongside Virgil Tate and his wife, Della, who were warm and easy people with no interest in gossip, and the conversation was good, and the evening was better than any Christmas evening I had spent since Clara. Marvella Calhoun observed from across the room with the expression of a woman who is composing her observations for later distribution. I noticed this and made the deliberate choice not to care about it. Afterward, walking out into the cold night air, Eleanor and I stood for a moment by our horses I had ridden. She had come in her small wagon, and the town around us was settling into its evening quiet, fires burning in windows, the voices of children carrying from somewhere down the street. "I have a gift for you," Eleanor said. She reached into the wagon and brought out a small cloth-wrapped package and held it out to me. "I was not prepared for this," I said so. She laughed, not the short, polite kind, but a real one. "You did not need to prepare anything, Jonas. Open it." I unwrapped it. It was a pair of leather work gloves, beautifully made, heavier than anything sold at Calhoun's store, with a careful stitching pattern along the cuffs. Handmade, clearly. And clearly made for someone with hands the size of mine, which meant they had been measured against something, perhaps the gloves of mine she had seen me wearing while working on her property. "You made these," I said. "I had time over the storm," she said. I stood there holding them for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Eleanor," I said. "Yes, when you said that first day, where was I 20 years ago?" I paused. "I have thought about that more times than I should probably admit." She was quiet, watching me. "I thought it was a joke," I said, "but I could not quite decide how much of a joke it was, and it followed me home, and it has been following me around ever since." "Is that right?" she said. "Not a question, exactly. I am 52 years old," I said. "I am not going to be anything other than what I am. My knees ache in the cold, my hair has been silver for years. I am set in my habits in ways that are probably annoying, and I have been alone long enough that I may have forgotten some things that require practice." I stopped. "What I have not forgotten is what it feels like to be truly glad of someone's company." I had forgotten that I had forgotten it until this autumn. The night was very still. The stars over Harlow Bend were the close, particular stars of High Plains winter, enormous and cold and indifferent and somehow beautiful because of it. "I am 47 years old," Eleanor said. "I have been a wife, and I have been a widow, and I have been a mother. And I have managed this long by understanding clearly what I need and what I do not need and what I simply want because it would be good." She paused. "I do not know what comes next for us. I think that is honest." "That is honest," I agreed. "But I know that the last 3 months have been—" She stopped, looked for the word. "Better," she said finally. "They have been considerably better." I held the gloves in both hands. The stitching was careful and exact along the cuffs. She had made these over a cold week when I had stayed away out of caution, which struck me now as a fact with a certain irony in it. "I would like to call on you," I said, formally, properly. "If that suits you." "It suits me," she said, "and the town can think what it likes." She smiled, that slow, traveling smile. "The town has always thought what it liked regardless. I gave up managing that some time ago." We said goodnight. I rode home through the cold and the stars, feeling something I had not felt in 11 years. Not exactly joy, something quieter than joy but more permanent. The sense that a door had opened without a great noise, just a soft, sure swing, and the air on the other side of it was clean and good. I put the gloves on the table by the door where I would see them in the morning. I thought about Grace, Eleanor's daughter in Abilene, who worried that her mother was lonely and foolish and too proud to accept help. I thought about what a daughter's love looks like when it is tangled up with the desire to be needed. I thought about the note, "No urgency when you have time," and what it had cost Eleanor in her particular pride to write it. I thought about the town and about Marvella Calhoun and about the way people look at a thing and see only the version that fits what they already believe. And I thought about the fact that Eleanor Marsh had spent a stormy week making me a pair of work gloves, stitched careful and true to the measure of my hands. That was not nothing. That was not nothing at all. The winter moved through February and into the softer uncertainties of March, and things changed between Eleanor and me in the slow, deliberate way that things change when two people are old enough to understand the difference between rushing and arriving. I called on her properly as I had said I would. I came to supper twice a week, arriving with whatever practical thing needed doing and staying for the meal and the long, comfortable conversation afterward. And we built something between us out of those evenings, a careful, honest, genuinely good thing. The town adjusted its understanding, as towns will when the narrative settles into something less combustible than scandal. Marvella Calhoun was disappointed, I suspect, that there was nothing more dramatic to observe than two middle-aged people eating supper twice a week. Virgil and Della Tate approved warmly and made no secret of it. The preacher, who was a practical man, noted that Jonas Hale and Alina Marsh were both in church every Sunday and appeared to be in better spirits than they had been in some time. And that seemed to him to be the extent of his concern. Alina's daughter Grace came to visit in April, which I had been quietly apprehensive about. She was a young woman of 25, dark-haired like her mother, with her mother's watchful eyes and something more wary in them than Alina had. She arrived on the afternoon coach, and Alina brought her to supper on the third evening of her visit, which I understood was not an accident. I shook Grace's hand and she looked at me with the direct, measuring look of a person who has prepared herself to be skeptical and is trying to decide whether the skepticism is warranted. Over supper, she was polite and a little guarded. She asked me questions about my ranch, about how long I had been in Grantham County, about my late wife. I answered everything plainly and without embroidery. Alina said little but watched her daughter's face the way a patient person watches a door they know will eventually open. After supper, Alina went to tend to something in the kitchen and Grace and I sat alone for a moment at the table. She is happier than she was when I visited in September, Grace said. I am glad to hear that, I said. My mother is not a woman who requires taking care of, Grace said. If you have come to that conclusion, you are mistaken. I have not come to that conclusion, I said. Your mother is one of the most capable people I have met in 52 years of meeting people. Grace looked at her hands. I worry about her being alone out here. She is not alone, I said. And she has chosen to be here. That choice deserves to be respected. Grace was quiet for a moment, then she looked up. She talks about you in her letters, she said. She wrote, in January, she said there is a man who comes and does what needs doing without making a production of it. And it is, she said, it is the most comfortable thing she has known in a long time. I did not say anything. I wanted to be angry about that, Grace admitted. My father has only been gone a year and a half. I wanted to think it was too soon and that she was not thinking clearly. She paused. But she is thinking more clearly than I have seen her think in years, I believe. She is a very clear thinker, I said. Grace smiled, and in that smile I could see her mother entirely, just a younger version of it. Take care of her, she said, and it was not a demand. It was the honest plea of a young woman who loved her mother and had decided to trust a man she had only just met, which is one of the harder things a person can do. I intend to, I said. Alina came back from the kitchen then, and the three of us talked for another hour about ordinary things, and the evening ended well. After Grace returned to Abilene, Alina and I sat on her porch one warm May evening watching the sun go down across the plains, the long, extraordinary plains sunset that never grows ordinary no matter how many times you have seen it, and she said quietly and without preamble, she liked you. I liked her, I said. She told me you said you intend to take care of me, Alina said, and there was the edge of mischief in her voice. I did say that. I hope you understand that I intend to take care of you right back, she said. That is not a negotiable point, I laughed, a real one from somewhere deep and easy. I would not want it any other way, I said. We were married in the Harlow Bend Church on the first Saturday of June, 1884. It was a small wedding by any measure, a dozen people, the preacher, Virgil and Della, Grace and her husband come up from Abilene, and a scattering of neighbors who had known us long enough to understand what it meant. Alina wore a dress the color of dark sage that she had made herself, and her hair was down, which I had not seen before, and she looked like herself. which is the best thing I know how to say about how a person can look. The preacher said the words and we said the words back, and when it was done, Alina looked at me and smiled and said very low, just for me, "You took long enough." "I know," I said. "But you got here," she said. "I got here," I said. "I am not planning to go anywhere." That evening, back at the ranch, her property and mine joined now in the practical and legal way. Though we had already joined them in every way that mattered, we sat on the porch in the long June light. And I could hear the sound of the cattle moving in the east pasture and the wind in the grass and the particular quiet of a house that has two people in it instead of one. Alina rested her head against my shoulder. The evening cooled around us. "You know," she said, "when you first came through that gate with your axe, I almost sent you away." "Why didn't you?" I asked. "Because you did not look like a man who was doing me a favor," she said. "You looked like a man who had found something that needed doing and was going to do it." "There is a difference." I thought about that. "I suppose there is," I said. She laughed, that quiet, easy laugh, and the June evening settled around us, and the stars came out over the high plains, and the clock in the house behind us ticked steadily, wound now and on time. I have thought many times in the years since about what Alina said that first morning. "Where were you 20 years ago?" It was a joke. It was also the truest thing she could have said to me. Because 20 years ago, I would not have been ready. 20 years ago, I was younger and quicker and considerably more foolish, and I would not have known what I was looking at when I looked at Alina Marsh. I might have seen a neighbor. I might have seen a woman who needed practical help. I would not have understood that what I was being offered, gently, without ceremony, over a cup of coffee beside a pile of split firewood, was the chance to be truly known again. You do not always arrive at the right place at the right time. Sometimes you arrive at the right place 20 years too late. And then you discover that 20 years too late is also exactly when you needed to arrive, because it took you that long to become someone worthy of what was waiting there. That is the thing about second chances on the frontier or anywhere else. They do not arrive with banners, they arrive ordinary, a gate that needs fixing, a woodpile that is running low. A note that says no urgency when you have time, a pair of work gloves stitched careful and true. Alina and I had 11 good years together before she passed in the spring of 1895, quiet and at home and with her hand in mine. Grace and her family came, and the town came, and there was a proper remembrance. I wound the clock myself that first morning after, and I have not let it stop since. I am an old man now. My knees ache considerably more than they used to, and the ranch is smaller than it once was, and the mornings are long in ways they were not long before. But I have the gloves she made me, kept in a box on the kitchen table. And I have 11 years of evenings on a porch with a woman who knew exactly what she was about and chose, quietly and without drama, to let me sit beside her. 20 years ago I would not have been ready for that, but I got there. Eventually I got there. And that, I believe, is the whole lesson, that love does not always arrive when we are young enough to be careless with it. Sometimes it waits until we have learned to be careful. Until we understand what it costs to lose something good, and therefore what it means to be handed something good again, ordinary and plain and real. Standing in someone's yard with an axe in our hands and nowhere particular to be. If you are somewhere in these years of your life where the house is quiet and the days are long and you have half convinced yourself that the good things were all behind you, I want you to hear this. Go fix the fence. Split the wood, cross the fence line when something needs doing. You never know what is waiting on the other side of an ordinary morning. Thank you for spending this evening with us here at Rusted Saddle Stories. If this tale found you where you needed it today, we are truly grateful. Leave us a kind word down below and share this with someone who might need to hear it. Until next time, keep writing, friends. The trail ahead is longer than you think.